Well, I think mythology has been confused because people think mythology has to mean worlds of gods and angels and devils and evil spirits and good spirits. And in other words, the two-story worldview mythology is what mythology is, and everything else is something else. But mythology is just simply story, just any kind of story that accesses the spirit depths. And it may not have these supernatural elements in it. And even when it does have these supernatural elements in it, you must think of it as just a story. This was just the way that people for thousands of years storied, was talking about their depth interior life with these fantasy figures of angels and devils and so forth. But you don't understand at all what they were doing if you don't see that those were just symbols for things that were actually happening in their lives. So for we modern people who find that too easy to literalize, we have to think of ways of speaking what we might call existentially or phenomenologically about those stories, or write new stories that are not flawed, as you might say, with that old two-story way of thinking about it, that actually say the same thing to us about our interior life as the old two stories do. And once you've done a little bit of that kind of translating back and forth, that opens up for you the whole of history. You can then see that whether they were Greeks talking about Aphrodite, or whether they were Buddhists or Hindus or Christians talking about devils and God, they were talking about the same thing you can talk about in other ways through phenomenological and existential language today. Teaching someone else is a very individual process. I don't know how to generalize on it, but I do know how to give a sermon on any topic out of the whole Bible. Just give me any verse you want to. Let's take something like walking on the water. Well, you just tell that wonderful story about Jesus and Peter and all those guys, and then you make it clear that they were in their safe boat. And what is your safe boat, and get out all the safe boats that you live in your life, and how walking on the wild waters of life is scary when you have to leave your safe boat. And here Jesus is already out there walking on the water, and he says, well, come on then. You can see, you can get existential in a hurry with any one of those stories. And I have a lot of favorites because they're very easy to tip over. But that's a nice experience. I've done sermons like that in a lot of churches where they never had any experience with this at all. And I can have 90% of the people there on the edge of their seat wanting to hear this way of looking at that. I've never looked at that story that way before, kind of awe. I think people just have to go through a number of experiences and they begin to get it. That's what I've noticed. In our circles, we do that with the Bible every night.
I think more in terms of methods. Gene thinks about sermons. I think about methods and like a Bible conversation. You have a very simple method of a Bible conversation. You ask people, you read some short little piece, you ask them what they heard, and they tell you, and then you ask them what struck them about it. You get their feeling about it, and then you ask them how it addressed them, how it challenges them in their lives. And so if they try to get into their literalistic stuff, you just keep coming back to the simple question, how is that for you in your life? So that they're just grounding stuff in their life rather than doing interpretations. Just use simple methods that just get down to people's real lives.
I think we actually translate it into things with which we're most familiar, which has the effect of making us familiar with that language. I think Joyce talked about methodology in doing so. I think that's probably the best way, because what you're really doing is letting the group experience demythologizing or changing the language or relating the old stories of the Bible to their stories in their current way of talking about their own lives. So that's really a kind of sermon building as a group. That's what, so the group builds through those methods, builds their own translation of that scripture in terms of their own life experiences. Now, if I'm giving a talk, I'm doing the same thing as I feel. I'm taking that scripture and performing those methods in my own being before them. I mean, I'm translating these verses of scripture into verses that I imagine might register with their lives. Something like that is the key, I think, is getting people to realize there wasn't anything wrong with these people that had this two-story language. That was just their way of talking. But it is not our way of talking anymore, and it's really not even a good way of talking when we take it literally. It means that we don't really have any grasp of what they were doing with it, and we're not doing anything with it that's not just foolishness. So you've got to translate in order to understand and appreciate these great ancient saints, as well as appreciate yourself as a saint on the same level as they were. They don't have any magic we don't have. They were just talking about their lives with their language. Now we're talking about our lives with our language, and we can have this communication across the centuries.
Yeah, you talked about jargon earlier, and I think it's something like that. You have to learn translations, which can become jargon or not. But it's like you maybe don't even use the original words for a long, long time. But after a while, after you've translated enough and get it into your bones what the real truth of it is, then you can go back and use the language. I mean, it's beautiful poetry. And when you know what you're, like I say, dear God, and I know I'm not talking about a person, but to me, it makes me sense that personal relationship to all that is, to be able to speak in that way. Or you can talk like this book that you're reading about the devil. You know, there's devils, there's demons, there's all, there is, you know, and you can talk about that as long as you know that you're not talking about those certain things. You're talking about these things that go inside you, and they are demonic, and they're almost like a devil. They're like that. But you have to leave the language alone for quite a while, I think. It's sort of like the word love that we talked about, that sometimes you have to leave that word alone, and maybe it comes in again and you get it sullied up, and you have to leave it alone and use other words and other understandings. But then you can come back and pick them up, and they're great poetry, and they're very emotionally evocative. I would listen to them and find out what they're thinking, where they're imagining they might want to do, and just to get a sense of what their past experience has been, and I would listen a while, and then I might just, if it seemed appropriate and they were open to it, I might share some of the things I have done that they are looking at, and just share my own experience from it. I doubt that I would tell them anything specific to do.
I think one of the things they have to learn sometime or another is what language religiously they want to speak as their home language. It's much like English or Spanish or French. You have a native tongue. Now I can speak Buddhism, but Christianity is just my native tongue in terms of speech about the essential spirit matters. And I think people just have to decide. It's just like, what's going to be my native tongue? It's kind of like, where am I going to live? Dallas or Fort Worth or Boston? What's going to be my native tongue? Christianity, Buddhism, Islam. And it doesn't mean you can't learn more than one language, but I think everybody practices a language, a heritage. At least it's much simpler to try to do that.
Well, everybody doesn't I mean, I think some of the people you meet now, these young, they're not practicing anything.
There are critiques in our best science of psychology and so forth of bad language. But there is not necessarily any one new mythic language coming into being. I feel like the Buddhists are recovering the mythos of Buddhism pretty well. At least the liberal or existential Buddhists of our time are doing pretty well. Christians, in comparison, are doing very poorly. So it's very rare that somebody can meet up with a person practicing Christianity who is capable of speaking the language in a new mythic form. That's why I think the work with the CRC is very important, because that's basically what the CRC network is about. First of all, is training ourselves as a network in the new mythos that will function properly for Christians in the coming century. And we may learn elements of that myth from Almos or Freud or Einstein, but we're going to take their stuff and make our story out of it as people who are also reaching back through our own history into our own revelatory events and bringing forward what was a great treasure there to contribute. So it's a dialogue between the culture and the heritage, but it's a new creation that Christians have to create for themselves, Buddhists have to create for themselves, Muslims have to create for themselves. We can help one another. But I'm not going to do the job for Buddhists. They don't have to do that. I'm going to do the job as best I know how for myself as a Christian practitioner.
Now, I think it's a big task. It's sort of like when you mentioned the monasteries in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, or whatever, keeping things alive. It's like our little experiment is just trying to keep something alive, and it's the best we can do to experiment with it and try to keep it alive. To try to get any bigger than that is biting off more than we can actually chew.